Oh, A Soldier's Life. So the title is slightly misleading. I'm going to talk about the, come on. There we go. All right, some Playmobil for everybody. Is that, everyone can see that, hopefully. It's all good. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So a little bit more about me. Some of you won't know me. Some of you do. I thought I'd say a little bit about how I got here and tell the story about how the book came into being is the plan, a little bit about why it's different than some other ones. So I was born there in Toronto, but I grew up in mostly Brantford, Ontario, which be famous, a few of you will know about, except for Wayne Gretzky, who probably means nothing to many of you. I initially thought I would, I don't know, halfway through my undergrad, I thought I would do do more Assyrian and Near Eastern things, but I ended up going towards Roman stuff. And then I moved around a bit and eventually ended up here in Winnipeg. This is not a shot from today. It's not quite that cold yet. The river isn't that frozen yet, but have been here for, this is my 12th year. And during my time here, I have taught a course on the Roman army 3 times. The 4th time is coming up in the winter. And there's a past student and colleague in the background. Now, the first time I taught it was in it was in the spring of 2010. And in that case, it was great. It's a good turnout, good discussion. I used, I think, at least one book by someone named Jan Liboek, which was great, but it became clear early on, and I hadn't realized this at the time, that there's a lot of technical names and other details that was maybe a bit beyond some of the students. Many of the students took the class maybe didn't have much background to Greek and Roman stuff, and so that was a bit much. So I started thinking back then about finding some sort of replacement and possibly making one of my own, which has taken 10 years to happen. So one of the things that probably stands out about the title, and I know a couple people have flagged it sort of on Twitter and other ways before, is that I don't call it, although my course is called, I think it's just called The Roman Army. The book is called An Introduction to the Roman Military. And so why military and not army? The one of the standard sort of images, and although this is Playmobil, is that it is a sort of a uniform body of soldiers who all kind of look the same and extremely well organized and disciplined, and to some degree that's true. But once you sort of step back and zoom out and look more closely at the Roman Empire and some of the evidence that we have for armies and soldiers, what we tend to find, and if you look at this map, and I come back to it later, we have a whole bunch of provinces, and this is a whole bunch of provinces here and around Gaul and Italy and Greece, etc. Lots of provinces and lots of individual names for provincial armies. So what we find, for instance, in the epigraphic evidence, and Latin especially, is things like the Illyrian army, Exercitus Illyricum, the African army, Exercitus Africani, the German army, Germany army, Exercitus Germanici, the Moesian army, Exercitus Moesia. Those are just a few examples that I just pulled up from CIL. And so they thought of it as many armies rather than one colossal army that we sometimes do today, in part because of how we divide our own armed forces. So that's why I call it military and not army. Now we're going to go way back to another influencing, or another thing that influenced my decision to focus on the kind of material that I did. I've long been interested in frontiers. I think that was in the little overview and introduction that I gave to Ruth and she gave me. For better or worse, one movie that had a big impact on me was Dances with Wolves, way back in 1990. I remember going to see that in the theater in Brantford and being struck by the experiences of, in this case, in this movie with Kevin Costner, one of the only ones where he could act, where he plays a U.S. soldier in the prairies, essentially, in the U.S. in the middle of the 19th century, and whatever issues with the movie, but I was struck by his sort of experiences in this environment, and I sort of stuck with me for a long time. And in fairness, most of my, when I think about Roman and Greek and Mediterranean things, I often think about the frontiers. I'm always slightly embarrassed when people talk about, oh, you're ancient historian, classicist, whatever, your favorite part of Greece or something. And I'm like, oh, I haven't been yet. Most of the places that I've been to are frontier places, and they feature quite prominently in the book. So places like one end of the empire, track of the time, northern England, not far from the Scottish border, where you find Hadrian's Wall and Vindalon, which I'll come back to briefly. If you keep on heading, I guess, sort of southeast, you come to the forest, the vast forests of Germany. Here's one near Salzburg, which is not too far from modern-day Frankfurt, where there is a largely reconstructed base that I couldn't go into because it was closed by the time I got there, back from the before times, February, when you could travel, to the Danube River. Romans had all sorts of ways of understanding frontiers, from rivers to mountains and beyond. And the Danube and the Rhine were important frontiers for them. And this is another place that I've thought a lot about, hence the Exercitus Moesii bestseller, where there are a whole host of different forts and things, like this one, Novi, which is a later Roman fortress, mostly, to probably my favorite. They're all great. Northern England is magical, but I love the Middle East, and been to Jordan, fortunately, well, a couple times recently, once when I was, I don't know, 5. But in Jordan, we have some of the best preserved fortresses, including one, another part of the frontier, this one, which is way up on a hill and has that amazing view of the sort of desert, basalt desert below. So the frontiers play a big part. The periphery of the Roman world plays a big part of my thinking and interest, and shows up in this book. Okay, so the next issue I was thinking of, how am I going to structure this? Lots of things are organized chronologically, proceeding from from wherever they're starting to wherever they're finishing, and of course a lot of that's artificial. I personally, it's just a personal preference, tend to prefer things that are more thematic. I like looking at themes and different aspects of whatever the subject is. So I was interested in going this way, but I also, because I was in part aiming this for students and a general audience, and I was also kind of thinking of my family, both immediate family and extended family, who has limited interest in classics and Mediterranean and Roman army things. I wanted it to be something that they could read with their background and follow along, and possibly even be vaguely interested. So I tried to, Dawn doesn't like that. I tried to organize it a bit like a story, at least to some degree, with beginning, sort of middle, and end. It still would have all of the stuff that we think about. So soldiers training and, tightly organized formations with their fancy equipment and armor, fighting off themselves often, but also assorted non-Roman groups. But I was also interested in the wider aspects of their lives, from where they did number 2s and number 1s with their friends, their colleagues in Roman forts, like here in Housteds in northern England, to letters and, some of the best evidence for Roman soldiers, the Roman military, are all these letters they send back and forth. Either family members send to them, or they send to family members, complaining about where they are, or asking for sometimes more socks or various other great things, as indicated in documents like these Vindalon tablets. And also I was interested, there's been, it's sort of hard to believe, there's been so much published and on the military. I don't think I think it'll be difficult now to master it entirely, and there still continues to be lots of new things, new areas are being examined, explored, greater appreciation now to the non-male components of the military community. So a lot of great stuff coming out of England, Germany, and so on, looking at, say, women and the military as well. So I wanted to try and make it as well-rounded, covering as many aspects of life as I could. Okay. Now, why have I done this? Now, despite that, this went through many rounds of peer review. A lot of people like lots of reviewers, lots of them like the thematic focus, but some are still like, a chronological focus has a lot of merit too. So but it's, fair enough. I have 3 maps here. This is the Roman Empire around about the starting point, well, a bit later than that, sort of in the mid-1st century BCE, before Gaul is captured by Julius Caesar and all that. And so the Roman stuff, inside here, and then it becomes here and then there, to this map that I already showed you, where it is at its peak, to what happens when you get to probably my favorite period-ish, late antiquity, when things get split in half and there are new organizational groups and things change a lot. So the problem with doing a strictly thematic approach, is you end up putting together lots of diverse evidence that doesn't always reflect some of the changes that take place. So I believe, what did I do? My attempt to solve this problem is in part, this means going back to the frontiers and my focus away from the center. In the center, we have guys like this, the Praetorians, possibly like this, to more of the soldiers on the frontiers from, these may or may not be auxiliary soldiers, heads and mouth, from Trajan's column, colorized for National Geographic, to these guys from the 3rd century CE in Syria, Dura Europa. So focus on these kinds of soldiers, and I decided to pick out three historical soldiers. So these were individuals who I know, or we know existed, but maybe haven't featured very much in discussion, because all we know about them is a very small bit. So the first one, of the most famous of the lot, and this is not quite contemporary, but a mid to late Republican artwork depicting some Roman soldiers, these guys here, as well as some other people heading off to a sacrifice, but and maybe you can't see it, I don't know, you can see it because of this, I'll move down, Titus Pullo. So if you remember the HBO series Rome, 2 of the main characters are Pullo and Vorenus, both one's a centurion and one's not, who go through a wide range of activities in and around the Roman Empire as it transitions from republic to empire. And these 2 individuals aren't entirely fictional, because they both show up in Julius Caesar. And so I took Pullo as one of them in the TV show. He's not a centurion, and Caesar he is. And I made his lifetime approximately in his era as the starting point. Okay. And in theory, the other 2 soldiers, we would see how different aspects of the story changed from one soldier to the next. The other 2 that I picked, and I hope I haven't forgotten. Oh, it doesn't like that, do you? Why don't you like? Okay. Was someone named Aurelius Polion, and I can thank, a few years ago, social media, some advertising of this article that was published about a letter made by this Aurelius Polion to his family, in which he covers a few things. And so I made this guy who's in this papyrus letter from Egypt as the second figure. He's maybe a little bit later than I would have liked him to be, sort of the second half of the 2nd century CE into the 3rd, some 200 or so years after Pullo, but still sort of peak, so-called peak Roman Empire, Roman history. And even if you look at this art, it's not the best comparison, but things have changed, and this is a roughly contemporary piece of art. To my 3rd guy, my late antique guy, Flavius Aurelianis, who shows up in an epitaph around the middle of the 4th century CE. And you can look at these, this mosaic from Sicily, and those guys may or may not be soldiers. Some debate about this, but they look different from the soldiers you see here to the ones you see there. So things have changed over time. Flavius Aurelianus, as I said, appears in this epitaph, and gives us a few details about his life. So it's centered on sort of the experiences of these three individuals, Pullo, Polleon, and Aurelianus, and it looks at their lives over the course of a possible military career. So just to sort of just about finish off my short introduction, and this is unfortunately, this is the biggest I can make, the table of contents from the proof, but it gives you an idea of how then I ended up organizing it. So as I said, kind of a frontier focus and more of an emphasis on the soldiers, but at the same time, it includes a lot of the stuff that you think about when you look at the Roman military, and it sort of has a beginning, middle, and end, and that it starts at, after going through the origins and background, I talk about enlisting and recruitment and up through training and what they look like, into, the fighting and training and all that stuff that goes with that, to what happens afterwards, both after battle itself to later in their career and family life and so on. And that is the structure. We're at, okay, that's pretty good, for 20 minutes of the book. And I'll just make a minor shameless plug for one of the ones that Ruth mentioned, because it might be out next year. And if you read this, you might like that too. Part of that broader interest in experience. I don't know when it's coming out. I only have the cover, but this is coming out at some point next year, in which it'll look more closely at the experience. And it's aimed at a general audience, and in some ways pick up some of the stuff that I mentioned in this book. So yeah, thank all of you for coming, both in the kitchen next door and in Australia possibly too. So I'll stop now and answer questions, hopefully, or or not. I better get rid of this, or not at all.
That's great. Thanks very much, Conor. It struck, you started with being Gretzky, but with I think the production of books. You're the second most famous production of Brantford, Ontario, maybe in the future. As Gretzky fades into the past, maybe you'll be the number one. So thanks very much for giving this great overview. Yeah, I have the book, and I read a few chapters. I'm no Roman army expert. I'll admit I'm no Roman army aficionado even. And I thought the way you've structured it is really admirable, right? It is an interesting way to do this kind of textbook, to follow these individual lives through these themes, and you do get a sense of a story, and you're kind of drawn to keep reading. So that I think is a really interesting way to structure a book, especially a textbook for students. And the other thing I'd say, at least in my opinion, the book, and I will get to a question eventually, is that you're right, your first part is really well done on sources, approaches, historical overview, the kind of stuff that I think a lot of people on this talk will face with students who really have virtually zero background in classical antiquity, and then take courses like the Roman army because they're sort of interested in what they've seen in movies or seen on the History Channel. And you've done a really great job of packaging that kind of necessary information, again, in an engaging manner at the beginning. So I encourage people to get it and read it. It's a page turner. It can be on your Christmas list. So I will ask maybe a question. So you mentioned, your interest, as I know, is in frontiers. And so I'm just wondering if you can give us a sense of how does your focus on frontiers in this book make it different than other approaches to the Roman army that are out there? I mean, do you think that by focusing away from the center of the empire that you draw new conclusions, or that you give students, so the audience for this book, an appreciation for different aspects of the Roman army or military?
Thank you. Good question. I don't know if I have an answer. Yes. Okay. What will I say? So, I mean, a lot of the other, I think other books that I have looked at before, and I said they're great, and they have their own strengths and so on. Say the Le Boeck book, Roman Imperial Army, originally published in French, translated to English, has lots of highly detailed information. I guess some of those, like his, and another one that sometimes gets used, is a slightly older book by Graham Webster, which has a lot of frontier material too, but maybe it's a bit more focused on the fortresses and some of those kinds of details and organizational details and some of the operational details and so on. And I think actually, and Lubowek has a lot of that too. And I think it was the fact that some of those points are maybe the many hundreds of names of units and things can be a little, to say nothing of ranks and whatever, can be a little overwhelming. But I'm overwhelmed by them regular myself. So what does I think, again, thinking of my sort of target audience and also the audience, friends, family who maybe don't would read this, I think my impression was a lot of people, and even actually colleagues who had a colleague, friend at work when I was there who she did Greek art and no interest whatsoever in anything remotely related to this. But I remember having a conversation with her the last time I saw her, however many years ago, in the UK, and I was saying, "Oh, I'm working on this," and she's like, "It'll be, I'm thinking of doing this." She's like, "Oh, it'd be much more interesting, with looking at the life of the soldiers rather than some of the other stuff, and the life situated into the other details too." So, I think, I don't know if it's, I don't think there's necessarily anything, there's nothing groundbreaking that I've uncovered. I think more. It's more, I think it's just more, I've tried to bring out more of the human experience without downplaying all the horrible things that they do, but just try to make it more appealing. And I have tried to bring in, those other books, they're 20, 30 years, well, now it's 2020, so 30, 40 years old, 20 to 40 years old, try and bring in some of this new research, especially some of the stuff on the psychological impact of war. There's been more stuff for 10, 15 years, and I say the family stuff has really taken off as well. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. I agree. It's a great synthesis of social history, not just military history. And I think that's one reason maybe, you'll have a kind of wide audience. I'll just turn over to Ruth, and I'll just remind people, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can also put them in the Q&A, which I hope is at the bottom center of your screen. And then in a few minutes, we'll start going through those questions as well. So I imagine Dr. Whately will answer questions about his book, about the soldier's life in ancient Rome, about Roman frontiers, about Don the dog, about what it's like to shovel a driveway in Winnipeg, any topic whatsoever. So,
any. I shouldn't have said that.
So Dr. Whately, I was going to ask you, first of all, I'm actually really excited to hear that there's more discussion happening with social history and that women and non-male items are being looked at, because as you know, I'm always looking at that angle in my studies. But specifically, I was wanting to ask you, were there any specific and or significant pieces of evidence that you used for your discussion in your book? Like anything that you really studied that gave you some real insight into what you wrote about?
That's a good question. Yeah, good question as well. I don't know that I could say that there's one typical. I'll mention some of the highlights, the ones that I quite like myself. But it doesn't happen as much anymore, because there used to be much more of an emphasis on what the literary sources say, especially the historians like Tacitus and so on and so forth, which are great, but they give a quite narrow perspective. And one of the things too, and if you read, one of the things I like reading, maybe sometimes more than others, parts with the military stuff, is besides acknowledgments. So I like reading some of the historiography of the discipline. And so I had the thing, kudos to Simon James. He has this paper where he goes through how it's changed over a few decades. And to some degree, there's been, I am answering questions. There have been divisions between, say, what historians will write and archaeologists will write, and maybe epigraphers will write, and sometimes they don't always. So I did try to bring in as much diverse evidence as possible, and I tried to, in most of the chapters, focus on something different as much as I could with certain things. There are limited things I could do with certain kinds of evidence in a book like this. One of the things I actually did try to do was to keep the price down. I know often a lot of the other things I've published, if you bought one of those, kudos, but they cost like a lot of money. So that meant some restrictions with photos and stuff, but yeah, I tried to present some diverse stuff. And then to get to diverse evidence, get to some things that I quite like myself, I mean, go back to the, I don't know, it's a cheesy movie, Dancing with Wolves. I mean, I do like the letters. I like the letters that soldiers exchange with themselves. Some of the most interesting things are, the letters you get from family members to soldiers, or from soldiers back to, and those little bits of personal details where they say, you know, I'm writing you again. You know, I haven't heard from you last time. It's like, why? It's sort of like, why aren't you picking up the phone? I keep on texting you and calling you. You're like, answer. And you know, there's all sorts of reasons why that wouldn't have happened back then. And so I do like those. I mean, I still like historians, obviously, Procopius is whatever, but I also, you know, the other things, some of the more the personal items, like there's, you know, thousands of shoes from Vindalon just in one place. And to me, those are also amazing. Any of these sort of perishable things that have survived in these, you know, remarkable circumstances, I think are great. The children's shoes, the women's shoes, men's shoes, socks, and various things I think are wonderful. I think after a while, I gather they're less impressive if all you do is, is dig up shoes. But for someone like me, I'm still kind of impressed by them. And then also, I would say, I've always, I like art. When I was younger, before university, I did art stuff. And then I decided it was horrible, and I left it behind. But I still, you know, I like the visual depictions of, so, you know, some of you are in my classes, a lot of Trajan's column, and I love the sarcophagi, and, you know, and I love the frescoes. We have hardly any, but that one from Dura Europos that I showed. So there's lots of, so that's a roundabout. I like a lot of it, you know, the diverse range. And I should say there's lots of new evidence being used now too, or newer approaches and so on that are really great. And I think have really helped open up and expand what we know and what we can know, or try to know, or guess, you know, about these things.
Thank you so much for that. I look forward to reading the whole book.
Thank you.
Just as I suspected, the audience have a lot of questions. So I think, as we did last time, Ruth, I'm going to suggest maybe we turn away from the talking heads here and turn to some of the questions from our audience. So I'll start with the first one I saw that was in the chat from Joanne Douglas, a close friend of the Department of Classics here in Winnipeg. Was the life of a soldier a terrible one, or did they enjoy it, especially ones sent out to the frontiers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I saw some of those ones on the side pop up. I think it could go either way, to be honest. I think for some it probably was not an ideal experience, depending on where you go. So if you were, I mean, for some, I imagine going to northern England in the winter, it's damp and cold. That might be, you know, less pleasant than some other places. But I think, I guess in my mind at least, there's, you know, a lot of things that a lot of my answers are just my opinion, and different people have different views, and there's lots of whatever. I think, I think some did. I mean, a lot of the frontiers and places, they had a lot of the amenities that Roman citizens would be used to. There might be baths and, you know, inns and bars and various other things. So there's a lot of the forts, once they're set up and they change over time, they develop these larger communities where lots of things were possible. So you could, you know, even if one of the things I didn't mention at the top, it's in the book, you know, one of the issues is, you know, could they marry? They couldn't marry soldiers for a while. They could, and then they couldn't, and then they could again at some point later. So family life and all that goes with it would be appealing. And I think obviously that, you know, there's a good chance you might die. But then the ancient Mediterranean, you know, there's a good chance you might die in a lot of ways anyway. And I think, you know, the appeal of, I imagine, the appeal of stable income and regular stable income, shelter, and other things would be appealing. And of course, there are lots of people, I mean, even in the Republican era, getting back earlier, you know, a lot of people would, so they go off on campaign and they go home afterwards and they go off back on campaign again. Some just found it an appealing sort of thing without getting into psychological matters. Oh, they're all coming up now.
I can see the recruitment poster already, right? There's a good chance you may die anyway. Join the Roman Army. Another question from the chat, and then I'm going to switch to the Q&A for a bit. Marco, dear greetings from Germany. Hello, Marco. Thanks for coming to talk. Why did you choose this specific time frame or these specific time frames?
Yes, good question. That was actually one that changed in the course of the making of this book as well. I think when I obviously Marco, because of going a year ago, almost today, being in Germany, the Titia Dignitatum conference, being more late antique in lots of ways. My initial sort of thinking was, I think the first time I ran the course, it was an Imperial era course going from like Augustus to Severus Alexander-ish, so very whatever. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of inscriptions and stuff and people know, whatever. And I felt more comfortable with this. And this is one of the things that came up, I guess you can say in some ways, this is where peer review has worked out very well. Gave lots of good feedback and suggestions for changing things. And I think initially I was going to pick initially only Imperial and even into late antiquity because I couldn't help but bring some of it in. But one of the suggestions, if you can even go back a bit earlier too, that would be useful for the classroom setting, which was why I brought in the Pulo and beyond. I think, if this is wildly successful and they're like, make a second revised edition, I think I'd be tempted now to go even further back, start at like the Punic Wars and go later, maybe, I don't know, add 2 characters or not individuals or something. But so it was partly my initial plan with doing the course, reviewer feedback. And it seemed like, I just felt more comfortable. I think now I'm more comfortable with more of it, but I think at the initial stages, I was like, well, I don't want to go down these roads and have people say, oh, this is all wrong, or this is all, and to try and keep it manageable in size too, would be my answer. Thank you.
All right, keep going. So I see we have 13 open questions. 14, another one just came. So I'll just switch to the Q&A from another close friend of the department, my mom, about how long would a soldier be at a frontier fort? Questions I can't answer for, so please let her know.
That kind of changes over time too. Depends on what kind of soldier they are. I think there's slight nuances for length and so on, but in like the Imperial era, so when they are so-called professional soldiers, and I haven't read it, but I know there's something new someone has said, oh, professional is sketchy. Haven't read it yet. But paid regularly, long-term pay career-wise. We have these 2 groups, these legionaries and these auxiliaries, and usually legionaries serve about 20 years and auxiliaries serve about 25 years, give or take. So that's in theory how long they would be, assuming no death. They didn't die. They didn't quit. I don't think there was much quitting. There is evidence of desertion and that kind of thing, and there are, harsh penalties if you do that. Although the penalties get less harsh over time because they're like, well, we need you to stay. I 10 to 20 to 25 years. Some might stay there for longer than 2, because I think a lot of them, they made lives. They had unofficial wives. And then when it was legal, they had wives and partners in and around the forts. And it wasn't, I think most of them, I don't know how many, wasn't just a little fort off by itself, out in the middle of nowhere, like my Dance of the Wolves idea, or rather a larger, and some of them were, in close to other settlements and so on. So they might stay there for a good part of their life. Over time, many of them would be born and raised in that community. But then on the other hand, there were a whole bunch of people who born somewhere and get so-called shipped off somewhere else, and they might move around a bit depending on their career path and so on. So it kind of varies, but if you have an ordinary career, at least in like the 2nd century or so, CE, AD, you might be there for 20, 25 years, not including after retirement and so on. but sometimes longer. I should say, sorry. There are like some of these crazy examples. I was reading something very recently. I can't remember what it was, a new article or something. There was some, I know it was for my Romans and Barbarians class. And yeah, there's you get the odd inscription where someone, they served like 40 years or something. And they're like, I don't quite know how that happened, and take it for what you will, but yeah.
Great. Another question then from our friend Dr. Sukava. Great talk, Dr. Whately. Thank you. And returning to your analogy, do dances with wolves, themes, or similar analogies of North American frontiers still help you or your students to imagine in more accessible ways the individual experiences of Roman soldiers? Is there another analog you reach out to that you feel is more accurate? So I guess thinking about ways to get this accessible. And he adds that your book is definitely on his Christmas list.
Thanks, Tyson from like the center of the world, Delaware. So, well, I mean, Biden-ish and so on. So it wasn't meant to be a dig. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I even though that movie had an impact on me and I was interested in those sorts of things, I've been sort of, I don't want to force analogies, and partly Peter's introduction, reconciliation. I don't want to, there are a lot of complex issues surrounding this. I mean, occasionally I do bring it up, a little bit, but I tend not to. Maybe some aspects of the movie, and again, I was trying to see if I could stream it on something that I had access to. I haven't seen it in, I have no idea how long. I guess that's a 30-20, carry the 30-year-old. Anyway, wow. Okay, that's an old movie. Movie now, I haven't seen it in a while, but yeah, so I haven't. I mean, occasionally it's actually more on like Roman society, first year introductory course, maybe say a little bit about frontiers or something on like, a little bit on the North American experience. And there has been some scholarship on parallels with lots of research on obviously things on North America, and then some comparisons with Rome. If there is one that might be a reasonable comparison to make, and I was about to make it actually yesterday, and Romans, and then time got away from me. But one kind of alternative you could use, but only within, I would say, limited circumstances, is Rome and China, if only because both of them dealt with, around about the same time, they both dealt with interactions with similar peoples from the broad Eurasian steppe from the west to the east. There's a lot of shared characteristics, etc. And so I think in some ways they had similar approaches to things, let's build a wall and see how that goes. But also, some other aspects too. And I know almost nothing about China, so I'm not prepared to go too far with that just yet. But that would be another one that has could be used to some degree or other. Oh, and Iran. I should say Iran. There's been some great research on like late antiquity in the Caucasus, where there's been stuff recently, Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's been a lot of stuff, great research on frontier sites of theirs against steppe peoples and so on, which maybe could provide some useful comparisons too. Right.
Great. Another question from Dr. Aben McMaster. Do you talk about food and drink in the book? Do we have much evidence for the differences in provisioning, if any, in different parts of the empire?
Yes, I do talk about, I showed you the picture of the communal latrine at the fort near Hadrian's Wall. So both the intake and the outtake show up in the book in some degree or other. So I think, I remember now what I did. I think a long time ago, when I was doing my MA and I was doing Moesia, and I thought I would fit in all this sort of frontier logistics stuff into it, because I'm like, this is cool. And then I didn't. But so I did manage to talk a little bit about food. I talked a little bit about sort of some of the, well, I don't know if he's out there in the interweb somewhere, but Professor McKinnon, who's in our department, millions of things on this. And so I did talk a little bit about some of the zoo archaeological evidence from one place in Jordan, because I've looked at it for some other purposes. But so, yeah, we know, depending on what kind of excavations have taken place, And more recent ones have looked more at the floral and faunal remains, and can get a better idea of some of the diet of some of the soldiers. And so, yeah, we know, and I do take a little bit how it changes a bit regionally from one part of the empire to the other. So I think if you go to places like Britain and northwestern Europe, you find more cattle remains in some of the fortresses. And if you go down to Jordan, where I think about a lot, there's more like sheep and goats. So there are some dietary differences. I talk about it a little bit. I don't think I talked, it's funny, one thing I didn't talk a lot about was say drinking and water, but it is sort of one of the staple things. And do we know a lot about logistics? I mean, yeah, we do, in part because of that, because of, you know, incidental comments in authors. People always talk about Vigedius, or however you want to say his name, is this important military manual. So I should do like a shout out for the co-edited book with James Kloop if he's there. But he talks about, you know, one of the famous line, if you're going to war, I forget what it is, it makes some sort of line that gets reused about the importance of supply and diet. And then we some of these letters and documents from Egypt and Britain and various places have all sorts of great like lists of items that people need and so on. So yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot. And I talk
You
about
mentioned him by name, and he's appeared. The next question is
Oh.
were soldiers encouraged to have big families, or were there more controls within the military to limit those aspects, considering the risks and challenges of military life?
Oh, that's a good question. I think mostly because I think it's sort of, well, for, I don't know how long it is, like 200, 250 years. We used to think that around about the time of Augustus, that's when the marriage ban was put in place. So the Romans are like, soldiers shouldn't marry, or at least this is a view of some Roman historians, authors, and so on, would reflect some of this material. And this is the regular soul, the lower ranking ones, not the few that make up the officer class or whatever. And marriage was banned or discouraged officially up until, it used to be, the thinking was, I think, like 193 or something, but now it looks like it probably extended a few decades beyond. We know that by like the 4th century, it was legal because we have all these late Roman laws and they refer to this. So yeah, so I don't think they would have, well, on the one hand, no, they wouldn't, well, directly they wouldn't officially promote big families because you're not supposed to be getting married. On the other hand, they have all sorts of other things, laws and documents. I think of like military diplomas, which are these, they're like passports for those of you who don't know. So they're about that size, they're small, and it would give you citizenship if you were someone who served, and suddenly, you know, upon retirement, or sometimes a bit earlier than that, you might get a chance to, what are you getting a chance to do? A chance to get your citizenship. And some of those, the language changes over time, and we have them for like a couple hundred years, and about 100 of them, 100 years, 150 years, they talk about benefits for wives and children. So, but then about 140, they removed the benefits for the children. So that could be some sort of subtle attempt to like promote, you know, have more children and have them serve, have them sign up for Rome or something, but it'd be an indirect policy. So yeah, so basically that's, I think, the closest we could get to it, but the rest of the time, and there are, I guess I'm forgetting about the late antiquity. In later Rome, some of the laws, changes over time too, but they encourage or almost force sons of soldiers to serve, at least for a little while. So that would, I guess, be another encouragement to have, at least have eligible children without necessarily specifying, you know, how many. So sort of, but not really. Yeah.
I guess like with so many of these questions, the evidence changes, the evidence is ambiguous, and we have to read these implications that you're describing. From the chat then, Michael Cairns, what were the most significant changes among the Roman military in relation to the transition from the late Roman Republic to the early Augustan imperial period?
Well, that's another good question. Yeah, thank you, everybody. These are all great questions. This now I'm feeling like I don't know I'm the best qualified person. Okay, I would say I think it was the two things. I don't know. I would argue that two of the most important things. Number one was when the Civil Wars, or wars, whatever you want, however you want to characterize it, ended, and Octavian Augustus brings things under control. To me, one of the significant things he does is he cuts in half the number of legions that had been serving for Rome up to that point. So that is a huge, that's huge for all sorts of reasons. The costs involved with paying off new veterans, to getting all these formerly men who'd been under arms, getting them to move away from this lifestyle or whatever. So to me, that's like a big shift. And then, but also sort of connected to that is setting up, I think so far as we know, although they paid obviously people before, but setting up like a treasury that was responsible for paying soldiers around about that time, I would say would be another significant thing. So setting in place some sort of institution, if you want to call it that, that would funnel money to them, and some of the benefits with it, I think, would be some of the big changes. And then also getting back to the frontiers, like saying, all right, you're going to go spend most of your time away from Rome, not just because that's where the threats are, but to prevent them from coming back and marching on Rome, yet again. So yeah, that's, but I'm sure other people might say something else, but yeah.
Great. Another question from the chat from Lori Sarti. To what extent do you read the Theodosian Code as a testimony of the partial breakdown of the Roman military structures, towards men acting as military on a less professional basis?
Good question, Lori, and I'll wave to you too over in Germany. It's a good question. To what extent do you think that's a question? Yeah, I don't know. Well, first I'll admit that I haven't actually thought about that before. So I don't actually have like a straightforward answer for you, but that is a really good question. It has made me thinking about it a bit too. I don't know that I'd see it as necessarily a shift towards a breakdown of a less professional military. I guess, I mean, to me, it's just more reflects some of the changes in, like I said, the marriage things and children serving and some of their rights and privileges and so on. So I think it's just a reflection, not necessarily less professionalism. I mean, I know there are, some of the laws that sort of stand out are some of those about punishments for, like, if you cut off a thumb so you don't have to serve, and some of those interesting things. But I think because it kind of continues in the East, where I devote more of my attention, I sort of think it stays still pretty professional. But I'll say that now that you've asked me this, it's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about, because that's can send me off in other ways. But yeah, thank you.
It's the best kind of question, right? I'll just switch back to the Q&A to alumnus of the University of Winnipeg, now at the University of Ottawa, Dan Russell, who asks, what did you learn about ethnicity? Oh, Dan, I knew this is your topic, right? What did you learn about ethnicity in the military in your overall study, specifically attitudes to non-Romans in the military by literary elites? Did these attitudes change over time?
It sounds like it's an MA thesis related stuff, because I remember having a chat with this not that long ago. A good question, not surprising question. What did I learn about ethnicity? I would say maybe not a lot, and mostly because, why would I say not a lot? I guess part of it is, I would say, what I was putting down in this is a lot of stuff. Some of the viewpoints are already out there that I had used in classes and otherwise before. I mean, I don't really. It's not actually something that I'm trying to think now. What I put. I mean, I occasionally one of the things I do touch on. I have a chapter appearance, equipment, and identity. I think it's in there. And I mean, it's less ethnicity, I would say, and more some of the slight differences between how some of the soldiers are viewed from the center of power, in Rome, although it changes to, wherever it changes to, because we get, the language, different people, the Latin sounds different depending on where you are, and there's lots of far more qualified people than me to talk about the nuances of the language spoken in amongst soldiers and so on. So it's, yeah, I would say not a lot. I think there is a lot out there, but it's not something that I specifically spent a lot of time on. And I guess I could also say, I mean, these are more like thesis-y questions. I'd be happy to discuss those further too. I better stop there.
Great, and I apologize, I skipped over a question in Q&A from another important guest, Heather Whately. And I think you've sort of addressed this a little bit, but maybe I think you could maybe still talk more about it. Did these soldiers have families in their frontiers or from their origins or homelands? So are there soldiers who bring families with them, I guess, even despite the changing bans on family situations, I suppose?
Yes. Hi, Mom. So I would say both those. So far as we know, and yeah, there's been some of that. Has been some new interesting work on that. So some of them. So we have it changes over time, but in, let's say, earlier days, Republican era, less of the frontiers thing. I mean, that's one thing misleading about, I guess I've said about frontiers, is to some degree less applicable earlier, but so they had families and stuff back in Italy or wherever their families were. As you go through time from the late Republic into the Imperial era, it seems to me some of them, in theory, weren't supposed to have families. There have been some attempts to quantify the number of them who had families, and some I just sort of read recently, some papers on this. And it seems like it's maybe a smaller, at least this person argued that maybe only a quarter to a third had families based on the existing evidence. But I don't know what the split is between those who made them when they got to wherever they got and those who brought them with them. But it worked both ways, because there are also some of these diplomas I was talking about do refer to or allude to wives and partners. And I think some of the evidence shows that they enlisted over in wherever it was, and they went off to this frontier place to start their new life, and the partner went with them. And then late antiquity is different because they're all allowed to marry. So I think there are more marriages and families than there are laws about. There are all sorts of great laws. Actually, one of the things I could have said about evidence, also great laws even about marriage. There's so much legislation about marriage, especially as you get later, to do with soldiers and widows and stuff. It's all interesting too.
Great. Okay, I think I haven't skipped over anybody else's questions, so I'll just continue from the chat. Sean Strong, thank you for your talk. A question: what was the most notable consistency the Roman military held throughout each of the designated 3 periods in your book? And what was a key difference?
Oh, another good question. So many good questions. Okay. Hello, I think in the UK. What was the most notable consistency? That's hard to say. Oh yeah, I guess. I mean, a lot of stuff did change. I mean, it changed how they looked, and how long they served, and I mean, I guess I can give the cheesy. I say cheesy, but some lot of scholars would say like, oh, the backbone of the Roman military was the infantry, and the infantry stayed consistent from the mid early Republic through to later towards the end of antiquity, before finally cavalry becomes more important. So I'm tempted to say that, only because I feel like that's a big question, and it would be harder for me to think of something, because I think, the uniforms changed. I mean, you could say, I mean, it's almost a consistency. I mean, language use to some degree stays the same. It's not that what Pulo would say would sound the same as what Aurelianus would say, especially since Aurelianus was in Turkey, so he probably was speaking Greek and things. But Latin, right into the end of the, I guess as end of the 6th century, is in the Maurice Strategicon, and there's Latin command. So language, infantry, and I'd have to really think about that more. Might just have to get back to you on that. And the key difference, I don't know. I guess I'm my outlook is more, my understanding is more. I'm more of a I don't know, longue durée, long-term. Changes take place slowly over a long period of time rather than lots of abrupt things. So you could look at Pullo and Aurelia and say, oh yes, they're definitely not the same. And those images that I tried to show sort of reflects that to some degree. We have the, I guess I could bring it up, but I have the relief with the soldiers going off to sacrifice, and then the one that may be soldiers from the mosaic, maybe, and they definitely look at them and you say that they're different how they looked. I would say, I guess, looked in terms of their clothing, and some of the equipment would be one of the bigger differences, but I mean, still using swords and shields, wearing armor, so yeah, I think, yeah. So I'm gonna just say, I'm not dragging out this answer. Let's go with pay, okay? Because I think Pullo is not getting paid. I'll go back to money. I said another question. He's getting paid somehow, but it's not being paid regularly by the state. Whereas in Aurelianus' day, it still kind of is, although later things change, which maybe gets back to Sarti's question about. Anyway, yeah, I'll have to think about that. Yeah,
it's always hard to just sort of learn. Yeah, these kind of. What's the central difference? What's the central similarity? Are some of the toughest questions to answer as a historian of any kind, I guess. Where's my next question? Oh yes, here it is. So Michael Keane asks, what are some unique aspects of Roman soldiers' military career that separates them from a medieval or modern soldier?
There's a student, Michael, from Roman Barbarians, so he's familiar with some of the stuff I brought up in class or in the presentation. So what makes them, well, there are a lot of differences, I would say. Medieval, I mean, that gets, well, some of it gets beyond what I know. I know a little bit about the Byzantine stuff, less about the Western medieval stuff, but I think I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to say a lot of it, at least from earlier to later, is the sort of the vaguely and touched on in some of these is the so-called professional aspect, the regular pay, terms of pay, expectations for pay and service, and so on. I know, and often involving people, not always. No, I want to say that, but without maybe an over-reliance in some parts of the medieval world on mercenaries and stuff. So I think I would say that. And I mean, one of the things, modern militaries, it's a career, you can do it for a short period of time or a longer period of time. I don't know. I don't know a whole lot. But yeah, so I'd say, I think it was just similarities. Is that right? And differences? Is that between?
Just differences, I guess. What separates them? So yeah, just so.
I think a lot of people like to, so that would be one of the main separations from medieval to the Roman experience. A lot of the medieval, the ones in the West, the Byzantine, of course, were, they evolved from the Roman context, so there would be some similar things. But some of the equipment, changes, and some developments technologically. The stirrup gets introduced, later in Roman history, and some things change in that regard. As far as the modern military, I think there's a lot. I think there has been in the past a lot of attempts to say, the Romans are kind of like the modern ones. But I think, as much as my cheesy Playmobil guys all lined up, I even brought some here to just in case. But haven't needed them yet. Much as they all look kind of uniform, I think maybe the Roman wasn't quite as uniform as we used to think it was, and some people might disagree, but I think there's a little more leeway there for some personal touches. Yeah, a little more leeway. I guess they make up a slightly greater proportion of the population. I think views on war, maybe to some degree. I mean, it's different. We're in Canada. So many people here from so many different countries with different views and all this. But we have a smaller military, so I think there's a lot between them and now. I mean, they both had some, training and all sorts of stuff, but yeah, I think it would be a good size, a bigger list from contemporary to Roman stuff.
You sort of touch on the question's always there is what the differences are between kind of what we imagine antiquity to have been like, and thus want to compare ourselves with, versus what it's actually like. And there's sometimes such a huge gulf, of course, across so many different themes of the classics between what we want it to be and what antiquity was like, I think. So I'll switch to another question from our friend Natalie Swain here in Winnipeg. The letter that always strikes me from the Vindalon tablets is the invitation from Claudia Severa for her birthday. Can you speak to the experiences of the soldiers' wives on these frontiers?
Yes, that's one of my favorite ones too, and I almost mentioned it when I talked about the tablets. One of what I always bring up whenever I want to talk about the. So I was actually looking for my photo of it to put in my various things. I couldn't get to it, but yeah, it's. So we have, those of you who don't know, so those Vindalon tablets, it's basically, some of them tablets, I think it's kind of misleading because you think of chunkier things, but it's basically like using wood as a form of paper to write stuff. And a lot of them have been found in Britain and some of them in a few other places, I think Switzerland and elsewhere. And the most famous one, because I think a lot of them might still be stored in up at Vindalon, but some of the flashier ones are down at the British Museum, for obvious reasons. And actually, there's someone actually in Canada, I always found out here, but over in Western, who is working on some Vindalon tablet stuff. But so this is a birthday invitation. If I was quick, I could even read it out to you, but where Claudia writes to a friend, and I'm assuming it's a friend, and asks how the family is doing, and then including the husband and children, and then invites them for a birthday party. And it's kind of cool too. We don't have the response, I think, but we have a couple different hands. So possibly a slave has written most of the letter, or it could just be an officer or someone in the military, and then she does sort of the final little. Well, we think if she was only writing part of it, I think it would make sense to do the last bit. But we also don't have like a lot. We don't have much else like this. We have lots of women writing letters about family members or in the military and so on. The question was more about elites and what this reflects about this. But I think that said, that note aside, evidence is whatever. I think that probably this kind of thing existed in vast quantities all over the Roman Empire, wherever there were families, whereas the lower ranking soldiers weren't supposed to be married for a fair bit of time. This was not the case for the officer class, who could go nuts and get married, children, etc. And as I say, we have all this other evidence from Vindalon for all sorts of other things. So I wish it's the kind of thing I just wish we had more of. And yeah, I think it helps illustrate the wider I don't want to say entertainment, social options of and really drive home that these are elites and these are whatever, but this is not just a male space with just dudes off in. And in some ways, that almost goes back to the previous question. What's the difference? And these. Well, okay, that's not always true. Only because I was watching this movie set in Afghanistan, and they're off. It's all guys. And I know back at the bases in the U.S. or whatever, there's families and stuff. But here, like the families are there wherever they go. And even sometimes when they go off to war, the families go with them as well. There are some examples of this. So just the elite women are a big part of all of this, I guess. If that's, I don't know if that's, yeah.
I'm just going to use my moderator's authority here to skip a couple questions just to connect another one I see later in the Q&A from our colleague, Dr. Funke, about the role of women who are not wives, right? So what other types of women would have been present? Would there have been a lot of women present in frontier forts?
Yeah, that's one of the things, one of the more recent stuff. And, you know, I guess I know I've hidden intel that maybe someone might be speaking with us next year, and possibly, who knows, about this. Who knows more about this than me? But I think that I think there's a lot. I think that's one of the things that another important influence for this was contributing a chapter to the first thing of the Gibbs and Ripat and Milo's sort of themes in Roman society, and thinking about the more of the army as a military, as a social space. A reading all this great scholarship on, you know, they found so much evidence of women, not just like there occasionally, or not just Claudia Severa sending a letter, but they're living just outside the walls, but often sometimes inside the walls as well. So some of it, you could say, in the domestic sphere. I don't want to generalize women and family and preparing things from the ancient world, but I think so. That is one part of it. I don't want to numbers. Who knows? But a significant number. I think that's true all across the empire, and possibly even picks up as you get into late antiquity. So there's that side of it, and I think they might have had a more active role in some of the, getting back into earlier question, food production. So not only would food come from, you know, some things would get shipped vast distances, you know, by sea, and some by land, grain and whatever, but in a lot of places, like, a lot of the food was grown locally. And so again, some of the stuff that, you know, the animal remains, the plant remains can illuminate a lot of this. And so, although it doesn't tell us who is doing these things specifically and who's using them, we can at least look at them and say, well, people were growing these things at these forts and military communities. And it could have been the soldiers, and it could have been their slaves, because a lot of them had slaves too, but it also could have been other members of the family as well. So there's that side of it. And then there's even more interesting, or just as interesting, there are, I don't know what you call it, but female entrepreneurs. There are businesswomen, innkeepers, etc. One of the most famous ones, and I've forgotten her name. I say famous is relative, but better known ones. There are some tablets from, I think they're from Switzerland, and I haven't actually seen them myself. I keep on looking for a used copy, but nobody's selling them. I want my own. But she's named, I think, in a tablet or two, and so far as we know, she ran an inn either inside the fort or just outside. So I don't think she was unique. There were probably lots of, and the implication, I think, is that she was in a position of some power. And to use a really, maybe to get back to the one, was it Tyson, cheesy analogy of North American experience, there's a show on, I don't know, it's on whatever it is. It's on like the frontier in Canada, in like it's probably like Manitoba in the 18th and 19th century, and it's set like up on Hudson's Bay, and I've totally forgotten the name of it. But one of the main characters is this town where the British and the indigenous people are trading furs and stuff. One of the main characters is this woman who runs this inn around these soldiers and all the people. And I kind of think that maybe there are people like her, could be like this person in amongst, not without getting into other activities she might be involved in there. So I think a lot. I think it's big. I think it's and I think without them, you know, I think it would be a lot more difficult for things to run the way that they did.
Great. We have a few more questions. I'm just to let people who've put in questions know, I'm skipping people who've already had a question answered to get everyone who's asked just one, but I will return, I promise, to those who are asking a second question before we allow Dr. Whately to leave. Don't worry. So I'll just switch to the last question in our chat from Dr. Alison Brickey of the Department of English here at Winnipeg. Conor, thanks for this interesting introduction to your work. It sounds like soldiers are both engaging in combat and actively settling space and claiming it for the empire. Can you talk a bit about these two roles? Are soldiers natural fits for settlers since violence is so endemic to the act of dispossessing someone of their land?
Oh, that's a good question too. Gosh, that's a big question as well. Thanks, thanks, Allison. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Romans obviously do lots of, they take a lot of land. They take a lot of land in a lot of places. It started off in, central Italy, and then look, we got all this because we're the best. Yeah, so they are these two roles. Well, okay, so I think on the one hand, I mean, some of this is like the question of how they acquire empire, which is also a big, there's lots of work. And there are a lot of battles that they fight. But the big battles only happen so often. Those are often better known, and we think of soldiers, with their swords and whatever. I don't know, they got two swords, but whatever they're doing, maybe I should get my little guy out, get your spear or whatever, and you're fighting off whoever it is you're training in. Yeah, so you have these, some of the stuff Julius Caesar engages with in Gaul, fights off, I don't know, and the all sorts of stuff. So they are skilled at winning in war, in combat. As far as them like settling stuff too, some of it ends up being like I don't want to say like a 2 or 3 stage process, but they have the armies of conquest, and a lot of the conquest takes place in the Republican era. So even though we say the empire and republic, it's like really an empire existed before it became the Roman Empire, because they had an empire, they just weren't emperors yet. So in a lot of those cases, yeah, I would say, yeah, but personally, yeah, I don't know if they are the best fit because of what you're asking and implying, but I don't think the Romans saw it that way, to my mind, where and some of these frontier things didn't happen usually right away. Usually they go and they either manipulate some sort of leader to take their land. Oh, you've died. Oh, you left us your kingdom. I'm like, great, thanks. We're going to make it a province now. Or like Gaul, you sort of take it over. Or maybe you send in a few soldiers and say, this is our place now. So all sorts of sort of violent, different degrees of violence, I guess. But some of those ones who do the conquering aren't the ones who stay and then settle the land afterwards. Usually, sometimes the forts and settlements, some of the forts, they built tons of them. I don't know, hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many, all over the frontiers of the empire. Some of those, there was not much settlement there before. So like the stuff on the Danube that I mentioned in the slides, I've thought about a bit before. It's, so far as we know, that particular part was less inhabited than, say, like Gaul and other parts where, so there are differences there, but then the guys who are then living in these frontier places, once they become permanent structures and settlements, they're not necessarily the ones who made them an empire in the first place. Now, as far as then, yeah, it gets the other part of this. Yeah, that's all sort of you could say some of the modern comparisons too. I mean, one other aside part of this is you also tend to get, I haven't really touched on, but it sort of alluded it with the frontier stuff, is you sort of get, so you have the Rome of Italy and the center of power, and then there's this frontier, a lot of the scholarship, I know we had this frontier group, reading group, had this almost separate culture and society that changed depending on where you were, and that had elements of the Roman imperial experience and the non-Romans on the other side. So sometimes you have a almost like a separate identity that comes out of all this. that maybe isn't there. And I'll just say as the last thing, because it's such a big question, there's so much more thing I could say. I don't want to. Yeah, that's a good question too. Sometimes, actually, no. Yeah, and we're better informed about some places about how this would work too. So yeah, probably not the best. The Romans probably thought they were great because then the soldiers could do lots of things. They could, help enforce the payment of taxes and criminal cases and, legal matters. But at the same time, to some degree, if a place was in the Roman viewpoint, pacified, the soldiers would be moved somewhere else to less stable, again, from their perspective, places. So I don't know. That's my short an answer that I could give. A very, good question, but a tough one.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Conor. It shows the sort of difficulty and the productivity of these comparative imperialism, which I know you mentioned your Frontiers reading group here at Winnipeg was kind of working on. Hopefully, get back to after the pandemic's over. I'll switch back to the Q&A, and I think it's our last question before I come to our repeat offenders. So from Vince Evans, you talk about visual evidence in the book, and obviously have a fondness for the visual arts, even though you said you dropped out of art. But anyway, are there any pieces of visual or artistic evidence about war and military life in ancient Rome that you find particularly compelling or beautiful or moving, and which are perhaps not as well known or highly regarded as they ought to be? So you can't mention Trajan's Column.
Oh, Vince. These questions. Okay. Good question. Okay. I don't know. I mean, a lot of them are well known. So like the Trajan's Column is quite well known. I mean, it's one of the best pieces of visual evidence we have for them. It doesn't move me, but it's great. It's a wonderful piece of it's a wonderful thing. I think that I'm gonna say there are a few little things that, and maybe I don't really move me in the way that you're implying, but the one that kind of does, and again, he's still there. I don't know who else from Roman Barbarians class. So we talked a bit about the column of Marcus Aurelius, which is maybe less well known than the column of Trajan. And the column of Marcus Aurelius has, while it echoes the column of Trajan, those of you who don't know, they're both these giant, they're kind of about the same height. The Trajan one came first and the Marcus Aurelius one came after. The Trajan one starts at the bottom and it goes all the way up to the top, providing like a comic book version, sort of, it's not the best analogy, account of these two wars they fought in what is today Romania. Marcus Aurelius is it kind of does the same, but if you saw Gladiator, and apparently the second one is coming out someday, the opening scene, there's a second one they're making, I think. The opening scene in that movie, there's all these Roman soldiers fighting these barbarian guys, and there's Marcus Aurelius on his horseback looking like he's about to fall over. So that is the war that's depicted on this column. So that column there's a lot of more visceral graphic images of Romans soldiers attacking barbarian, generic barbarian men and women in that one. So that is quite a, so that would be one that stands out because there's just so much, it's an interesting thing made in Rome, showing Roman soldiers behaving badly, I think, from most of our perspectives, and yet, as far as like some other ones, I like the sarcophagi too, but they're reasonably well known, so I don't know that they count as less well known ones. There are one of the things that kind of intrigues me a little bit. I don't know, they're not necessarily great pieces of art, but they're kind of fascinating, and I want to look a little bit more at them. Is we get in, they don't necessarily move me, I'm just more intrigued by them. As we get in late antiquity, we get the book is invented, so we get there we go. We get the book is invented and the codex, and not only do we get then, rather than the scroll form, which is a bit unwieldy, you get, where you can open it up and see things, but you get illustrated ones, and some of those I would think, you know, there's some of the more famous ones are like the Vatican Virgil and copies of the Iliad, but they depict not just scenes from those poems, but in theory, they take, and there's also some Christian works as well, they take contemporary, so to them, the artist soldiers, and put them in these poems set 2,000 years earlier or 1,800 years earlier. And it's, I mean, I don't know how you would classify them, but I'm just kind of interested by those. I would say some of that, the last thing about art I'll say is that I like some of the even later stuff, which is not as well known for people from 6th century things, but maybe less well known. Oh yes, I know. Yes, there is a monastery in Egypt that dates to the 6th century CE, and I've just come across this recently. I can't remember what it's called, but they've found a whole bunch of frescoes which show things. I think it's more, it doesn't move me again. It's more just, I'm just amazed that we have this from such a late context. If I told you the name, that would be even better, but I can't remember. And I could run to the back of this room and flash them, but I won't do that because I wouldn't find it.
Okay, we're entering the lightning round of questions now. So we're going to try and do the last 3 questions in about 3 minutes. So, Michael,
Okay.
was it a difficult process to rise through the ranks for a Roman soldier? Could they expect to lead a legion at the end of their career?
Okay, right. Conscious of time, I would say it changes over time. I think when in late antiquity, it's a little bit easier to rise to the ranks than it was earlier. But usually the highest you could go in the height of the Roman Empire is when you enlist as a lowly recruit, you could become a chief centurion, a primus pilus. You're not going to get any higher because those people are, you know, too good for you in the Roman mindset. But later, there's a little more room for, I want to say meritocratic, but like vaguely.
Great question. I was about to hit the buzzer. All right, next question. Great answer. Sorry. What local people, or would local people be enlisted, especially in distant frontiers? The clock is ticking.
I could be completely short and say yes. Yes, they would. Yeah. A lot of people, local people served, Roman ones, non-Roman ones, depending on the time, the context, and the place.
Okay, and a last question then. I'll leave the last word to your mother. What was life expectancy for these soldiers?
Oh, okay. Conscious of time, this is another long question too. Like the other 2 were too, for that matter. I don't know if we have one. I don't know the proportion is of those who made it to the end. We don't have enough evidence for individuals. A lot of people made it to retirement age. So I don't know, half. But yeah, that's a hard question. Yeah.
Well, you can blame your mom.
I can send you a message after this, or I'll speak to you on FaceTime or whatever.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll stop there. I was remiss at the beginning to not thank anyone in my eagerness to get Conor talking. So I should also thank the Department of Classics, my colleagues there, the Faculty of Arts at the University of Winnipeg who've helped support this series, and especially the Chair of English, Dr. Brandon Christopher, who's helped immensely with the technical workings of the Zoom webinar format, for which I have zero skill. We do have more talks this year, though not this academic year, not this calendar year. Our next talk is February 5th, and if you'd like to have a list of these talks, you can certainly get in touch with me. My email address is pj.miller@uwinnipeg.ca, and I'm happy to give you the links to all the remaining talks. It just remains then to thank effusively Dr. Whately for this Herculean task of over an hour of question answering, a testament to both the interest that your work generates and your encyclopedic and comprehensive knowledge of all things Roman military. So thanks again. Thank you to everyone for coming, and we hope we'll see you again February 5th for our next talk in New Directions in Classics. Thank you.